Hi guys! So I've gotten a lot of questions in my Instagram DMs recently regarding watercolor, how to use watercolor, what's wrong with my watercolor technique. I've collected a bunch of different tips, tricks, and techniques that I use in my watercolor paintings and artwork that I decided to share with you guys. Just a little disclaimer for you guys, I'm not a professional artist. Watercolor is just another art medium that I like to use and sometimes make money off of. The knowledge I have gained over the past few years have been from trial and error, and I just want to share it with you guys. Feel free to correct me in the comment section down below, but please don't sue me if I say anything wrong. Cool? Cool. On with the video. Alright, let's talk materials. Obviously, you're gonna need some paper, your brushes, paint, water, paper towel, and it should be that easy, right? Actually, not really. It's a little bit more complicated than that. First, let's get into paper. Aside from the paint that you use, I think paper is probably the most important factor as to whether your art turns out good or trashy. Shouldn't use line paper, that's disgusting. Don't use printer paper either, it's too thin. You want to get yourself a really nice, dense watercolor paper. I am currently using some Strathmore cold press 12 sheet paper notebook, and it has been working pretty well for me. It doesn't pill, it's very nice and sturdy, and I can put a lot of water on the paper and it doesn't bubble. However, in paper, you kind of want to go towards more cotton in your paper, preferably 100% cotton. That has the best texture, is probably the best thickness as well. I would go for that. Okay, now onto the paints. Paint is really important in watercolor because it's essentially what you're going to be making your artwork out of. Watercolor paint comes mainly in three forms. It either comes in a solid form, a liquid form, or pencil form, watercolor pencils, which we will not be covering in this video because I'm not that good at using them. Let's take a look at the solid watercolors. They come in mainly two forms. They're either little chalk discs or they are little watercolor pans, which I would recommend way more than the chalk discs. When you go to Walmart and you buy whatever watercolor that they have, you're more likely to find the chalky rounds, which is essentially just dye turned into a solid form, which is not good watercolor. One thing that you should definitely get into the practice of doing is spraying your watercolors before you start to paint with them. Get out a little spray bottle, fill it up with water, and spray them and let them sit for like 3 to 5 minutes, and your watercolors will be way more vibrant and pretty before you start to paint with them. Moving on to your liquid watercolors, those are pretty straightforward. They come in little tubes and they are generally more expensive than the ones that come in pans or chalk rounds. Again, you shouldn't really use the paint from the tube. They're meant to be watered down. Another tip that I have that is extremely important is to swatch your watercolors. And this goes for most, if not all, art supplies. You need to swatch your art supplies because a lot of times the color that is on the tube or the packaging is nowhere near close to the color that you actually get when you water it down or when you draw with them normally. So always swatch your watercolors to make sure that you know what colors you are getting when you take them out of the package. And here I am swatching some watercolor paint because those tend to be the ones that are not as close to the color depicted on the packaging. I'm showing here some colors that are pretty close to what they have on the packaging, and then some colors that are not as close and kind of misleading. Now onto the brushes, which is something I used to struggle with a lot because I hated watercolor brushes. I always bought the ones where the little fibers of the brush would either break off or they would leave little fibers in my painting, which would make them look disgusting. Invest in good watercolor brushes. Yes, watercolor brushes, not acrylic, because that's what I used to do, and it does work, but watercolor brushes are special because they hold more water, so you can keep the paint in your brush for longer. That's why you're supposed to use them. God dang it, why didn't I learn this before? The other kind of watercolor brush are these water vessel brushes, which I'm not that great at using. They have these little tubes that you can detach and fill with water in the sink or faucet or anything like that, and then you just screw them back on to the head of the brush, and then all you have to do is squeeze the brush while you're painting and it'll add more water to the brush, which is really cool. I just haven't gotten the hang of it yet, but hopefully I'll be able to use them one day. The next most important thing in trying to do watercolor is just water in general. You need it to activate the paint. Now, the biggest tip that I got from someone was to use 2 water jars, vessels, cups, whatever, for your watercolor painting. You need to have one for clean water and one for dirty water. You wash out your brushes that have paint on them in the dirty water jar, and then when you need to add water to the palette or to your painting, you use the clean water. Eventually, your clean water jar will get dirty, so just replace the water as needed, but always, always, always have 2 jars of water. Another item that is good to have on hand is a tissue or a paper towel. Now, it's watercolor, so you'll be dealing with water, so in case there's a mess, obviously, so that it's easier to clean up. But it is also helpful for removing pigment off of your painting. All you have to do is wet the painting a little bit, wait for it to soak into the pigment and the paper, and then gently press down with your towel or tissue, and pigment should start to come off. Now, this can create some pretty cool effects, or it's also helpful for removing mistakes, which I make a lot. One of the most helpful things in watercolor painting is painter's tape. Now, it's really helpful for just making a nice clean edge to your artwork. I use painter's tape a lot in my artwork to just create divisions or just make a nice edge. And plus, the ASMR is pretty great too. The last essential that I have is some sort of fan. I have this little USB cable fan that I've used in some of my past videos if you've watched them before, and it's pretty helpful. Or I have this hairdryer, which I don't really use. If you do use a hairdryer, always, always, always have it on a low setting and on the coolest setting. You don't want to try to burn your artwork. Alright, so now that you've got everything set up, you've got your watercolors, you got your brushes, you got your water, everything's all ready to go, and you're ready to start sketching out whatever it is that you want to draw, and you use a very soft pencil. This is a common mistake that a lot of artists make when drawing, sketching things out for their watercolor paintings. Don't use a soft pencil. 2H or higher, all the way up to like 6H is perfect for watercolor. Okay, but let's say you don't want to leave your line art in the drawing. That's completely fine. You can always erase it, but do not erase it with a normal polymer eraser. Those kinds of erasers are very dangerous on watercolor paper. They can easily rip up the little fibers in the paper and make your watercolor drawing come out worse in the end because the paper texture is not the same and uniform. Always use a kneaded eraser. As long as you can still see the drawing underneath, you should still be fine with following your own drawing and stuff like that. But yeah, don't use a normal eraser, use a kneaded eraser. Okay, now that we got all the materials out of the way, now I'm just going to show you some techniques that I use in my watercolor paintings. The first one that I'll show you is the wet on wet technique, where I first wet the paper with some clean water from your clear water jar, and then I add some pigment onto the paper with a wet brush, and I just glide it over the paper. If you do this, it'll make the pigment feather out onto the paper and kind of fill the space that the water was in before. And it is very nice for making gradients like the sky, water, backgrounds like that. The second technique is wet on dry, which you just take the watercolor brush that is wet with pigment and put it on dry paper instead of wet paper. If you do this, it's great for detail work because you can always keep a sharp line, and it's pretty easy to make clear, distinct shapes. I find the wet on wet techniques have a lot more versatility though. If you add more water and then let that dry, usually it'll create a little ring of pigment around the color, which is pretty cool for making watercolor flowers, I would say. However, my most favorite wet on wet technique is the watercolor hand lettering, in which you write the letters that you want with water and then you go back in with color and just have fun playing around and mixing color into the little water shapes that you made, and it makes for some really cool calligraphy. The last few tips and tricks I have for you guys couldn't really fit in any other section of the video, so here are some miscellaneous watercolor hacks that I have. The first one being reusing the paint on your palette. I never wash my watercolor palette because usually I have a lot of colors on there that I would like to save for later, so just save them for later. Let them dry all the way and then just wait until you make a new watercolor painting or piece of artwork, and then all you have to do to reactivate it is add more water and it will become the color you had before, which is really cool, and less watercolor goes to waste if you do it like this. Layering on watercolor is so important because watercolor is a transparent medium. If you're trying to put it all on in one thick glob, you should probably be using gouache. But layering on your watercolor artwork will make it look a lot better. It gives it a lot more depth, and it is very easy. You just have to wait for it to dry all the way. To tell if your watercolor is dry, just look at the amount of sheen that it has. If it looks very glossy, it's probably very wet, and if you try to go through the watercolor with more watercolor on top of that, it's just going to bleed everywhere and make a mess. When it is dry, if you run your finger over it, you won't feel anything. It is completely matte, and it should be fine to do artwork on top of. So when you layer, you just have to make sure that it is completely dry before you do so. Line art. I had a lot of questions about whether you should do your line art before or after your watercolor paintings, and the answer is yes. It doesn't matter which one you do. It does matter what materials you use. If you use a water-based pen to do your line art, you have to do it after you do your watercolor, because if it is water-based and you put water over top of it, it is going to bleed everywhere and ruin your art. You don't want that. Alright, that is all the tips that I have for you guys today. If you made it this far in the video and you have some tips that I didn't include in this video, feel free to put it in the comment section. Help each other out. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in another video. Bye!